I've preached on the book of Esther a couple of different times, and we're going to be going through it relatively fast. You got quite a few chapters. It's going to be a shotgun approach, but it's an interesting book. It is one of two books in the Bible in which the name of God is not mentioned in the book, but yet the ruler in the book is mentioned 175 times. And yet to the reader who reads this book understands that God is the main character. He's putting himself on display in many different amazing ways, and he's yet unnamed. A little background: at the time, the Persian Empire stretched from modern-day Libya into Africa, all the way into Pakistan, Asia. It was the largest empire in history. The second great empire would have been the Babylonian Empire. There was roughly 50 million people inside the empire. The king in the book of Esther is none other than Xerxes, the son of Darius, who fought the Greeks and ultimately lost the Persian Empire to the Greeks. And the book's got Esther's name on it, but she did not write this book. This book, we don't know who wrote it. It could have been Ezra, maybe, Nehemiah, some Jew dwelling in Persia at the time, but somebody who understood Persian science, somebody who understood Jewish culture and had knowledge of both. But whoever the author is, it's really the story behind what God is saying. God divinely gave that person the ability to write this. So let's begin at the beginning of the book, Esther chapter 1. We're going to be moving through it rapidly, like I said. The book just opens by describing the expansive kingdom of Ashur. It stretched from Ethiopia, as I said, over to the edges of India, into modern Libya, Pakistan. He's not only the son of Darius, he's the grandson of Cyrus the Great, the Persian ruler who decreed that the Jews go back to their land after 70 years of captivity. And that's how the book begins in Esther. Many of the Jews went back to Israel under the decree of Cyrus, the grandfather of Xerxes. They went back. They rebuilt the city of Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple for the second time. They reestablished the lands for themselves. However, a large number of the Jewish people remained there in exile into Babylonian. They settled there. They were scattered throughout the province. We don't really know why they didn't all want to go back, but their life was set there. Just thought the hardship was there. Several years into Ahasuerus, which is the same name as Xerxes, the book of Esther opens, and he calls for a 6-month summit, and it does the king in the capital of Sassoon. Sassoon it's called too. This is where it occurred in roughly 483 BC. This was a strategic war planning meeting. It was a 6-month strategy. It's where the king is going to make his final preparations to try to invade Greece. And so he ends the 6-month summit with the military, planning a 7-day banquet. Now, as you look in your Bible in chapter 1, you're going to see that it's quite an extravagant celebration because it's anticipation upon the victory. And you see there's white and blue linen curtains in verse 6, fastened with cords of fine purple silver rods and marble pillars. The couches were of gold and silver and mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, white, and black marble. They served drinks in golden vessels, each being of a different golden vessel, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. This was a 7-day drunken orgy, if you will. And on the 7th day, Asher, after a week of intoxication, indulgence, decides he wants to put his wife on display. Her name is Vasta. She's Queen Vasta. So he commands his wife to show up on the 7th day and present herself in her royalty. Well, surprisingly enough, she says, "I'm not coming to the party." Eventually, concerned about her dignity would be tarnished, seeing how mostly the men would have been there, been in a drunken state. Some have suggested she may have even been pregnant with their son, a man named Axarius, familiar in history. She was uncomfortable being there in public. She says, "I'm not coming." Asher is furious with this. This is a public insubordination. This is an embarrassment. This is making him look bad in the royal court, as well as with all the other people. And according to chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, he was afraid that the queen's actions would start a women's liberation movement, that she would get the women thinking if she didn't have to obey, they wouldn't have to obey, and it would just spread through like a wildfire. He announces his intentions then that he's going to get a new queen. He makes it very clear that no one can disobey the king, not even the queen, or she'll be replaced or disposed of. He wasn't a very patient man, actually. So 4 years have passed. There's been no king. As you get into chapter 2, into Esther 2, verse 16, it says 4 years have passed before he gets around to selecting a new queen. Why 4 years? Well, this is found in 2 years of unsuccessful invasion into Greece. And this invasion happens happens in about 2 years' time, that it occupied him to deal with trying that, and so the Persian 2 years unsuccessful invasion into Greece fits right into the right history, with Vashti being demoted in 483 and Esther's coordination coming on at 479. So he's finally frustrated with his ability to conquer Greece, and he comes home after 2 years of effort and decides, since the war's not going well, he's going to need a distraction, and so selecting a queen seems like a great thing to do. As you look in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, it says, "After these things, when the wrath of King Asher subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And then the king's servants who attended him said, 'Let a beautiful young virgin be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the province of the kingdom, and they can gather together all the beautiful young virgins to Shunem, the cradle, into the women's quarters, under the custodian Hegiah, the king's eunuch, and the custodian of the women.'" That's a harem that they're talking about, in case you were wondering. "And let the beauty preparations be given to them. Let the young women be who pleases the king be the queen instead of Vashti." And this pleased the king, and so he did so. Okay, so you got a worldwide beauty contest going on. In general, we can assume that there's 50 million people in the Persian Empire, so now we have, if we take half of that, you got 25 million women, and that's at the point we are. The biblical text introduces us into the people in the main story, which are two Jewish cousins. They lived in the city of Shunem, as well as they are descendants of the original Jews, captives who were taken in by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon captivity. They were brought into Babylon centuries earlier. I should say their parents were. They were brought earlier, around 597 BC. The older of the two is named Mordecai. He's roughly 15 years older than his cousin, named Esther. Verse 7 says that her parents had died when she was very young, so Mordecai raised her. So here you are in the middle of 50 million people in the empire, and these two Jewish people. Her name is Haddish in Hebrew. It means myrtle, the plant. Her Persian name, Esther, may be related to Ishtar, one of the Babylonian gods. And it may also be because it's similar to the Persian word star, so she may have been named Star, or she may have been named after the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, which happens to be the love goddess. Whatever it is, it's not her Hebrew name. But that wasn't uncommon for them to do. If you remember, they did that to Daniel and his three friends, Azariah, Mishael, Hannah, and they became Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. That became their Babylonian names. So it was a custom to change them as part of their culture. And as you look in chapter 2, verse 7, it says, "So it just happened that a young virgin by the name of Esther was so lovely and beautiful." So lovely and beautiful. She didn't go unnoticed by the king's officials. So she was collected up in a group and would go into the palace to live in the harem with the other concubines. Josephus, the historian, Jewish historian, says there was about 400 virgins that were taken into the palace. 400 of them. The thing went around an amount of women that they first saw, and they rounded it down to 400 of them now. And they're in the palace, and at this point they have a year to get themselves all fixed up and beautified. I mean, I know we always heard that song, "Waiting on a Woman," but this is a year that the king's going to wait on the women to get themselves all beautified and roiled up. The intensive training was to go on for 12 months, and at the end of the 12 months, each of the 400 women would have the opportunity to make that impression upon the king. They would get to adorn themselves, dress how they wanted, to try to impress the king. And Esther would be most likely in her 20s at this point in time, and when she appears before the king Asher. In chapter 2, verse 16, it says, "So Esther was taken to the king Asher into his royal place in the 10th month, in the 10th on the Tabitha, in the 7th year of his reign. And then the king loved Esther more than all the other women." That must have been a very special woman. If you think of you going through hundreds of women, how that would become a blur at a time, and yet she stood out. She obtained the grace and favor in the sight of more than all the other virgins. So the royal crown was set upon her, and she was made queen instead of Vashti. And then the king made a great feast, a feast of Esther, and all the servants and officials proclaimed a holiday, and all the providence gave her gifts according to the king's generosities. And it was kind of like a Cinderella story as it starts out here. Esther stole the king's heart. This Jewish orphan, this child, exiled people have conquered. It's been moved to the highest position that a woman could be in the entire world. There's a power working here greater than King Asher. There's a power at providentially orchestrating his own purposes through the affection of this emperor. Significantly, through the entire process, Esther keeps her Jewishness a secret. And Mordecai had told her to do that because there was much anti-Semitism in the Persian Empire. Esther would only reveal that she was Jewish, but at that very important time, which we're going to see a little bit later. So Esther is chosen to be queen, and so she goes from being this little Jewish orphan to being the queen, and is driven by her physical and her charm. And not long after Esther is crowned queen, this is where the story gets fascinating. Her cousin Mordecai is sitting at the entrance of the palace. He's hanging around the palace. And why do you think he's hanging around? Well, he raised her, basically. You know, he was concerned about her, so he's trying to get any kind of word that he can. And in verse 22, it tells us the two king's eunuchs, Bigithan and Teresh, the doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. He overhears the plot to kill the king, to assassinate the king. These two royal officials who guarded the king in the private quarters had access to him and could really kill him. They were angry. We don't know what they were angry about, but whatever it was, they were infuriated about him. They were plotting to take his life. Mordecai just happened to be where he could overhear it. This could indicate to us that Mordecai is in places of the palace that would have probably been off limits to most people. He may have been given a position of power, we don't know, but he was somewhere where he could overheard this communication. And when he learned about the plot against the king, he reported it immediately. You see this in verse 22. And so the matter becomes known to Mordecai, whom told the queen Esther. And Esther informed the king Mordecai and the name of Mordecai's name. And the inquiry was made into the matter, and it was confirmed, and they were both hung on the gallows. And listen to this last part here. It says, and it was written in the books of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. The Persians kept records about absolutely everything. That's why we know so much about their history, and the King's Chronicles recorded what had happened, that the plot and how it had been overheard by Mordecai, and Mordecai informed Esther, and Esther informed the king, and the king's life was spared, and the two co-conspirators were hung. Mordecai's actions were written down in the royal record. And why was that done? Because the king needed to reward good behavior as well as taking care of people who were disloyal. He wanted to reward those who were loyal. Like all ancient Markites, other kings, Asher was careful to honor those who rewarded him and demonstrated the loyalty to him. And that's how he secured that kind of loyalty. And in order to do that, he kept records, and acts of special valor and services would be rendered to them. They would keep the records of their good doings, and then they would also write down the records of how they rewarded those people. Now as you get into as we're leaving chapter 2 and going into chapter 3, you're introduced into the next character, and his name is Haman. This man who was exalted by the king, a capable man, a Persian man. He had been lifted up above the other princes and other royal officials, but there was a very interesting thing about this man, and this is a key to the whole story. He was an Agagite. An Agagite, it says in 3:1, and also in verse 10, in chapter 8, and also in chapter 9, it says Haman the Agagite, Haman the Agagite. It keeps repeating this. It's not a small detail. It's the origin of Haman's hatred towards Mordecai, his hatred towards the Jews. To understand this, you have to understand the Agagites. And if you go back a little bit, if you go back to the Exodus of Egypt, the Israelites came out of Egypt around 1445 BC. It was nearly 1,000 years before this time. And in the 17th chapter of Exodus, by the Amalekites, and do you remember that name? The Amalekites attacked them. The Amalekites, the descendants of Esau, the one who sold his birthright. The Amalekites attacked the Jews, and the curse of the Amalekites, God cursed them in Deuteronomy 25, and it says that they were going to go extinct, and God pronounced a curse on the Amalekites. The God of Israel did that. 4 centuries later, King Saul conquers the Amalekites. You may remember it in the story in 1 Samuel. And the king is captured. The name is Agag, and he's the king of the Amalek. And Saul was supposed to kill him right then, there and then. He was supposed to kill all the animals, if you remember. And if we all remember, Saul did not do that. And that is what ultimately brought the fall down upon Saul. It brought the displeasure upon the Lord and removed the line of kingship through him. And the prophet Samuel stepped in, and you may remember this in 1 Samuel 15. What did he do? He hacked the king into pieces. Haman was an Agagite, and although it was almost 1,000 years had passed since the curse, 100 years since the hacking of the king Agag's death, but Haman knew his history, and he knew that it was a Jewish man. He knew it was a Jewish prophet, Samuel, who had hacked him into royal pieces. And to make things worse, Mordecai, he is a descendant of Kish. You can see that back in chapter 2, verse 5. And Kish is from the tribe of Benjamin, and Benjamin is the line of Saul. They knew their story, their history. They knew there was deep-seated animosity between the descendants of Saul and the descendants of Agag for obvious reasons. And it had been nearly 550 years that passed, and both Haman and Mordecai, Haman the Ammonite, Mordecai the Benjamite, had not forgotten the feud of their ancestors. The hostility erupts in chapter 3, verse 2. Let's look at that. We'll read it down to verses 5 and 6. It says, all the king's servants who were within the king's gates bowed and paid homage to Haman. And for so the king had commanded him concerning. He'd been elevated so high that everyone had to bow before him. But Mordecai wouldn't bow or pay homage. That's where the feud is in the heart deeply. He had nothing but animosity towards the Amalekite descendant. And then if you look at verse 5, it says, and when Haman saw Mordecai didn't bow down or pay homage, Haman was filled with the wrath, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they told him, the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the kingdom of Ashur and the people of Mordecai. He decided that he could not just kill Mordecai, he had to kill him and kill all the people around him, kill them all, basically. And so Haman does that. As you go down to verse 7, it says, I want to determine the ultimate day by looking into your historical sources to find the day to annihilate the Jewish people, and we'll have a genocide throughout the empire that day. And he goes down into and asks the king in verses 8 and 9, it says, and now the nation of Persia empire is full of Jews, and they are a threat to the empire. They are a threat to your throne and to your empire. They ought to be eliminated. He says that. They ought to be killed all the way back to Israel. We need to go all the way back into Israel and kill them all, even those who would return. Haman's system They are a threat. They're a threat to the throne. And furthermore, if we kill them all, we can confiscate their property, their spoils, and everything they own, and the vast sum of monies will come into the royal treasury. Esther says, great idea, basically. They hands them the signet over, stamps it, the genocide. Hammond hits the fast track. It goes on a royal dispatch, sending it out through the empire, kind of like a Pony Express. They would go a rider would go as far as he could to the next city, and another rider would pick it up, and they just keep going through and through. In verse 13 of Esther 3, it says, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young, old, little children, women, all of them. To annihilate. Nothing. It says that in chapter 4, verse 3, it says, in every providence where the king commanded to decree, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, wailing, and many lying in sackcloths and ashes. The message stretched across the massive Persian Empire very rapidly. That date had been set for the people in their land, in their local areas, to slaughter the Jews. In chapter 4, verse 7, when Mordecai hears the genocide, the decree, he tears his clothes, he's distressed, he's dressed in rags, he puts on ashes on his head, he's mourned openly, he's mourned publicly at this horrific act, this massacre, this murder of the entire Jewish population. Was this just simple payback by Haman? No, it's bigger than that. Satan's involved. Satan's involved in the efforts to obliterate the Jewish people. Thus, he tries to bring a halt to God's purpose and redemption in their behalf. Satan's basically involved in all bad, evil stuff. Well, it doesn't take long for the news to reach Esther. She gets the message. Mordecai informs Esther what Haman was succeeded in accomplishing, and gives her the copy of the royal decree. And he says to Esther, you have to go to the king and plead the lives of your people. That's simple enough. You think about it. You just go ask the king. You're married to him. You're the queen, right? It should be simple. And then in Persia, there's one little thing in Persia though. No one could go, including the queen, could go to the king without an invitation. Anybody who ventured into the presence of the king without being invited was killed on the spot, unless they got the scepter pointed at them. So Esther would be not only breaking royal protocol, she would also be risking her life. In chapter 4, verse 11, it says, all the king's servants and the people of the king, providence, knew that the man or woman who goes into the inner courts of the king, whom had not called, but had one law, put all to death, except the one whom the king held out the golden scepter, that one may live. Yet myself have not been called into the king these days for 30 days. The king hadn't even seen her for 30 days. And we have to be honest with ourselves here. We look at this and think, 30 days? I haven't seen my wife in 30 days. But he had a harem. Their culture was quite different. Not saying it's right, but it was very different. And she's afraid of his potentially violating her irrational husband, who had demoted Vasta down for one act of incompetence, not incompetence, but uncompliance. Mordecai was putting Esther in a position where she could lose her life if she did what she asked. Well, Mordecai comes back and this is where he calls for courage. And these are important verses for our own lives. In chapter 4, verse 13 and 14, do not think your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than any other Jew. Mordecai warned her cousin, look, you're dead if you do, you're dead if you don't. The whole thing. They're going to find out you're Jewish. You're going to be dead. And it's interesting that Persian law would even apply to her. They could actually come into the king's house and kill her because she was Jewish, because he had made that law. That's how the Persian laws would work, that a person could go in there and actually kill the queen. It says, for if you, continuing on down in the verse there, it says, for if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews in another place. But for you and your father's house, you will perish. And there's wonderful confidence here. You look at the promises of God, the covenant of God with Israel, the blessings sustained and to preserve them. Mordecai says, look, God will deliver them, will deliver the Jews in another way, but you won't survive. I won't survive. And that's where you get this famous line, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. He says, saying that God has divinely put you there. He reaffirms the divine sovereignty. He affirms the confidence in the revelation of God that he would preserve his people, but he also understood that Esther could perish, he could perish, and many other Jews can perish if she does not act. And as you go down to verse 16, embracing her divinely granted role, as you read in verse 16, it says, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shunem and fast for me. She says this, neither eat nor drink for 3 days and nights. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I also will go to the king against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Even if it costs her life, she's going. So she will do what she can to protect her people. Esther, interestingly enough, doesn't mention prayer, but fasting doesn't go on without prayer. And she says do this for 3 days. She mentions that her maids would be there praying. There were probably most likely other Jewish girls with her, or at the very least they've converted to Judaism. They understood prayer. Then she approaches the throne, and it must have been a very intense moment. The second that she waited to see whether the king would extend the scepter to her and welcome his beauty into his presence. To underscore the responses in chapter 5, verse 3, she comes in and he looks her way and he extends the scepter and he asks this question in typical royal way, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give you up to what you want, up to half the kingdom. Now that's wow. Her beauty, her presence, but she doesn't want half the kingdom. She wants her people. She doesn't want any part of the kingdom. So Esther replies a simple request. She goes and asks King Asher to put on a banquet for Haman and for her later that day. And we will do what he had offered. She didn't ask for half the kingdom. She asked for a banquet between her and Haman and the queen and Haman. And as you look in chapter 5, verses 5 to 8, it says, so the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared, and the banquet of wine. The king said to Esther, What is your petition? I will grant it to you. Whatever you request, up to half of the kingdom, it shall be done. Then Esther answered and said, my petition, my request is this. If you have found favor in my sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to a banquet which I have prepared for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. What is this? We have this first number one, and he says, okay, here we are. We're both here. What is the request? The idea was to tell the truth about Haman, the plot that was taking place. He's right here in front of the king, but something happened. The timing wasn't right, and she feels as though she's got to ask for a second request. For whatever the reason was, she just said, let's do this again tomorrow. And many of you may remember Luther in the court of worms, where he was being prosecuted for his books, his writings, and they were asking him to recant. And he says, at the end, he's looking, he's buckling almost, and he says, I need another day, I need a night. Who knows? Just keep that in mind as I move forward. Now Haman, and I love this, Haman loved this because there's a banquet for the king and queen. It's a private banquet. The king and queen, it fits into his big ego he's got. Haman, a feast, is feeling confident about himself. Not only had Asher exalted him and lifted him up, he agreed with the request to annihilate the Jews. But now the king and queen had invited him not only to one of these great banquets, but two of them. This is for humanly speaking, there was no more honor that could be bestowed upon a man in the kingdom there. So Haman heads back to his house. On the way back from the king's gates, he sees Mordecai, and he just kind of goes crazy with rage. To sum it up, he goes and he says, I've got to get rid of this man, and I will erect a gallows and execute him in the morning. It's a perfect solution. This descendant of Saul, this Jew, that night Haman slept soundly, and this is amazing. He probably was dreaming of his revenge the next day. You can just see Haman there sleeping with a big little smile on his face and thinking this is just the best thing ever. But on the other hand, if we go back to chapter 6, the king is tossing and turning. And whatever caused that insomnia, he does a very strange thing. He calls for the royal records to be read to him. He says, it tells him to go get the royal records in verse 1. And well, the royal records had been there, being recorded for years. They go and grab the set of records, and which one would they choose? You think, well, what are the odds? You know, he's got his life, his grandfather's, and keeps on going back. It would be like maybe hearing the royal records would be like counting sheep, maybe something monotonous, you know, like going through your history lesson and you're hearing your teacher like on Charlie Brown. I don't know. So they bring back some royal records to read, and what is the account they took was Mordecai's action to expose the two conspirators plotted against him. It was in the records, and he had forgotten about it. In chapter 6, verse 2 and 3, it says, it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthan and Tersh, the two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And then the king said, what honor or dignity had been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said nothing had been done for him. 5 years before Mordecai had reported the plot, never was rewarded. Well, an eager Asher wants to make sure that this is rectified. Meanwhile, in the morning, Haman arrives back from the royal court where he works, and the king Asher, he wants to ask to execute Mordecai. He's going to get go get the permission to go hang Mordecai, but before he can say anything, Asher asks him this question, and this is important in chapter 6, verse 6. It says, "What shall be done for a man whom delights to honor?" Now you know what Haman's thinking. What do I do for a man who I want to honor? Haman says, "Oh, give him your royal robe. Let him ride on the king's horse. Give him a prince to lead him through the city while proclaiming to the whole city, thus it shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor." In this shocking twist, expectation in 6:10, Azariah says, "Hurry then, take the robes and the horse and that you have suggested, for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave nothing undone that you have spoken. Things aren't working out the way that you wanted it to work out." Humiliation and shame and rage would be going through Haman right now. He has no choice but to do this. So he leads this guy through this parade, Mordecai through the city. And I just can picture the Mordecai up there. He's in rags and ashes still. And he's being led through and being, the disgrace that would have fell upon him. Well, when this whole disgraceful thing was over, and he's looking for comfort from his family and friends, this is Haman, and you go to chapter 6, verse 13, it says, "When Haman told his wife Zeresh and his friends everything that had happened, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, 'If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you would prevail against him, but surely fall before him.'" Basically, they're saying you're in trouble. If this is a Jewish man that you were just told to honor, and the king, you're going to wipe out, you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of the issue. The tables are turned. In confusion, Haman goes back to the palace later that day for the second banquet, trying to probably steady his heart rate, this horrifying experience. And the king again is overwhelmed by the affections of his queen, and he asks her again at the second banquet, and this time she does not hesitate. And if you look in chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, it says, "If you have found favor in your sight, O king, if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Would you spare the life and the life of my people? For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated." O King Asher couldn't believe what he was hearing. To threaten the queen's life is the height of treason. The king is furious. And in verse 5, it says, "Who is he? Where is he? Who dares to presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And you can picture this, Haman sitting at the table, feeling the noose getting a little tighter around his neck, and thinking, surely he thinks this, the queen is not a Jew, right? He's thinking that. Then with her hand points at his red-faced inner desk, saying, "The adversary, your enemy, this wicked Haman." All I can say is that the king is gored with fury. He gets up and he storms into the palace garden, it says. He remembers the empire program that Haman had gotten to authorize months earlier. He remembers how Haman had misrepresented the Jews as a potential threat, And he's literally signed a decree into law that it would involve the murder of his own wife. Well, Haman is still at the dinner table. He falls at her feet, as it says, in front of the couch where they were eating. He's begging for his life. Asher returns from the garden, blinded by anger, interprets Haman's outstretched plea for mercy. He's at the feet of the Queen Esther. He's pleading for mercy, and this looks very much like an assault on the queen. When the king comes back in verse 8, he says, "Will you also assault the queen with me in the house?" Instantly, the royal guard cover Haman's face, and they led him away to be executed. And how did they kill him? They hung him on the gallows they built for Mordecai. What a difference a day makes. In 24 hours earlier, Haman was on top. That was yesterday. Now the king is to take all his property and give it to the queen. The queen gave it to Mordecai, and the king exalted Mordecai. In chapter 8, verse 2, and chapter 9, verse 4, it says the king the king exalted Mordecai, and he became to the king of Persia like Daniel became to the king of Babylonian. What he was going to do about the king decrees and the law, Jewish law, because once they made this decree, he couldn't rescind the decree. What was he going to do? And the issue became overwhelming. And you look at this, and this is where I go back to, we've seen this happen with Daniel, and many a times that's how he ended up in the lion's den, because the king had gotten suckered into a law, and he couldn't worship God. And they had these laws that they could not reverse. So what were they going to do? How is he going to get around this? And as you look in chapter 9, verse 3 and 4, it says, "All the officials in the province, the satraps, the governors of all the doing of the kings worked to help the Jews because they feared Mordecai fell upon them. And because they had elevated him, and for Mordecai was so great in the kingdom's palace, and the fame had spread throughout all the province, for the man of Mordecai became increasingly prominent, because the king had elevated Mordecai to such prominence. They knew the attitude that the people had towards the Jews, and they knew that the word had certainly spread throughout, the queen also being a Jew as well. He made the decree that the Jews could defend themselves and their lives, and they could prepare themselves for that day. He said, "I can't undo the established day, but it could tell the people, you don't have to do this. The Jews can defend themselves." And that day came, that doomsday on March 7th, 473 BC. The Jews defended themselves. They were attacked. They were attacked, and there were deaths. There was over 75,000 of the enemies of the Jews were slain in that day. And the king backed them up. It was a day of remembrance. It was not to be remembered for the reasons Haman had thought. That day on March 7th, 473 BC, established a festival that the Jews celebrate to this day. That celebration, that time, it takes place every year. It's the Feast of Purim. Purim, from the Hebrew word for Jew, the Hebrew word for lots. It became because Haman had casted lots to determine the day in which the extinction of to annihilate the Jews. And so the word lots was used to identify that feast. It was a triumph because of God's care for them. And that's where, as you look in our opening reading of 9:23 through 28. That's where the Jews still now celebrate that today, that God had saved them. And so long after Haman was hanged, and Mordecai and Esther continued to flourish in the royal kingdom under Asher, the king exalted Mordecai to the second in command, continued to love his woman, his wife, Queen Esther. Against all odds, Esther and Mordecai and the Jews were spared. And not only spared, but they were elevated. And I like this in Esther chapter 10, verse 3. It says, "For Mordecai, the Jew, was second to Asher, and was great among the Jews, well received in the multitude of brethren, seeking the good of his people, speaking peace to all of his countrymen." It's an amazing story. At the end, we bring it to a conclusion. It says, where is God in the book of Esther? That's where we started at. We said we don't see his name mentioned. And while the real hero in the story, the power behind the story is never mentioned, but it is God. His hand of the providence, he is manifested in every single trial, every tiny detail. His providence, his presence is more powerful and seen than maybe in any other story of this complexity, taking the whole book to explain what was going on. His providence of working it from, filtering it down from 25 million women to one Jewish chosen woman to be queen. His providence in demonstrating in Mordecai being in the place where he could hear the plot of the king. His providence and the power of the sovereignty that can be seen in the night of the king can't sleep and gets the royal records read to him. And not just the royal records, but pulls the account of Mordecai being written. And even Haman's timing is perfect in the purpose of God. The invisible hand of God is evident everywhere. The absence of God here is not. It's ingenuous. It's the writer's strategic way of drawing the reader into to deeply think in life's circumstances and orders into the divine purpose. There are no coincidences here. There's too many. This is not random. The designer here is the coordinator. The power behind all of this is God. God literally is thundering through the book of Esther. There are no miracles in the book of Esther, but the whole thing is miraculous divine providence. People, places, time, actions. It is more marvelous, more miraculous. Not Hanan, not Satan, not Satan using Hanan could destroy the promises of God to Israel. No matter who tries to attempt to destroy God's purposes cannot succeed, because God has that covenant. He loves the people. He loves the nation of Israel. It is being fulfilled as we speak today. And the message for you in this, what we can take from this, while we're going through life and trying to fix all the little pieces in our lives that are falling apart, understand this. This is over and in and above and below our lives. There's a divine architect ordering every detail. And if you belong to him, and if you're in the covenant of his love, he is accomplishing his perfect will. You can rest in that, knowing that God is in control. The Lord still is on the throne. And in these challenging times, these changing days that we live in, you can become pretty distressed about all the things that we're going through, and the way that the world is, and the chaoticness, and the way that things are disconcerting, troubling, disturbing, distressing, frightening, but not so in the kingdom of God. Our divine architect is ordering our lives. And if we belong to Him, we're in that covenant, He is ordering our lives to be lived in that wonderful way. Our lives, more so than any other time in our nation history that I can remember, that we are called to stand up and be believers. Because you can't now stand by and say nothing, because they're forcing you to say either you are or you aren't. So take this message, and apply it to our lives, knowing that God is in control. Amen. Heavenly Father, as John was praying earlier, you are going to return, Lord. We know that's coming. We feel that it's coming sooner, Lord. We know, Lord, that you are in full control, Lord. We see this throughout the Bible. We see your people in horrid situations, and yet you bring people into power to protect your people, Lord. And we pray, Lord, as we live in your nation, this nation here, Lord, United States, Lord, we pray for our country, we pray for our leaders, Lord. We pray that you would bring the believers to stand strong for you, Lord, and for you, and whatever that costs, Lord, may it be. But we know in the end, Lord, that you reign. In Jesus' name, amen.